Greetings and welcome back to room 303, and we now turn in our conversations to the roots of the sea. This is a course on the humanities that we are now offering. We call it the roots of the sea, an integral approach to story. We're borrowing, of course, from the biblical text, the book of Job, the 36th chapter, the 30th verse, the roots of the sea. I mean, think of it this way, guys. If we think of the sea of stories that are out there, and if it's true that we are in fact the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, we're also, of course, the stories we decide to accept, or of course the stories we decide to reject, then what we want to do, and this is our goal in this course, is to try to ask about the roots, the foundation, if you will, of the sea of stories. And therefore what we're going to try to do in this introductory lecture is three things. We want to introduce ourselves to our learning theory, to our annotative theory. What do we mean when we talk about this integral approach? We'll talk about it as our big five. Then we're going to review the course offering that will be listed for you at learnstrong.net down the left-hand side in a playlist called The Roots of the Sea. It'll list, and this course could be offered in other platforms as well. And then finally, we're going to maybe suggest ways to approach our study together, allowing you to take and gain the most benefit, we would hope, from our study. Now, first let's remind ourselves. Key concepts in our studies in room 303. Everything for us begins with a definition of learning as the capacity or the desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. That, of course, in meaningful ways is hypercritical for us. We're always asking, how can I in some way connect or relate the new information that I'm receiving to stuff that I already know? And of course, in the process, we'll always be talking about our three levels of reading or annotation. At level 1, we always ask, what does the text say? Here we're summarizing. At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, we're asking about themes and messages. At 2B, we're asking rhetoric. Not what the writer says, but how the writer says it, literary analysis, literary techniques, and the like. Finally, at the third level of reading, which is the most important for us, we're asking, how can I relate to this information in some way? At 3A, how can I relate to other texts that I'm familiar with? And again, remember, our use of the word text in 303 is very inclusive. We're willing to argue that anything you've seen, heard, watched, been exposed to, we're going to qualify that as text. And so, for example, if you're a gamer, that is a text. And of course, it's a very important multimedia text usually, right? And then finally, and most significantly, we'll ask about any text that we want to mean. How can I personally relate to this text in some way? And the better job I do at 3B, the more I'm going to argue learning is actually taking place for me. Now, we're calling this an integral approach to stories, and what do we mean by that term integral? We mean simply we're referencing our big five. About any text that we're studying in 303, we're always interested in at least 5 perspectives or 5 ways of looking at the text. The first of those 5 is what we call epistemology. What can I actually know? And what does this text tell me about what I can know? Of course, we've pointed out that there's kind of 3 ways to think about epistemological knowledge. One of those is the absolutist position. I am right and you are wrong, and if you don't agree with me, well then, you're completely wrong. Of course, we know about this approach epistemologically. It leads, of course, to airplanes flying into buildings and lots of people dying. So we're a little reluctant, obviously, to adopt the absolutist position epistemologically. However, we're not going to argue that, of course, there are no absolutes. You ain't met no 200-year-old people, and to that degree, the only difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. And of course, we're going to argue there are some absolutes. But by and large, the absolutist position is pretty dogmatic, and of course there's times when we're going to embrace that, but other times we're going to be a little bit leery of that. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum epistemologically is the relativist position that says there is no truth, there are no absolutes. Of course, as we said many times in 303, the only problem with a statement like there is no truth is that it seems like you are positing a truth. And to that degree, the performative contradiction pretty much kicks the relativist position epistemologically kind of out of the realm of to be taken seriously, which is the reason why so many people go back to the absolutist position. However, in 303, and we're going to argue that this is in fact a position epistemologically derived from a whole bunch of the stories that we're going to be talking about. The fallibilist position, as we call it in room 303. It's simply this position in terms of what we can know. I think I'm right about whatever it is that I hold to be true, but I'm willing to admit the potentiality I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong thing that, of course, is the real invention of modern science as we understand it. If science becomes absolutist, we don't call it science, we call it scientism, don't we? And it's every bit as dangerous as any other kind of dogma that might be plaguing our epistemological landscape. After epistemology, we go to ontology. The question here is simply, who are you? Right? What is this argument of being, and more importantly, of value itself? To that degree, we're always asking questions about what does the text tell us about who we are and what we value as being most important. Number 3, we talk about psychology. And the prism on psychology is all about issues of motivations. What is it that motivates us to behave in the way that we do? And what are our fears, our anxieties, the things that, of course, give us some concern? That's what we call psychology, the study of the individual mind. Along with that, we're very interested, number 4 in our big 5, in the study of sociology. Not the study of the individual mind and motivations, but rather the group. And why is it the case that sometimes people will behave in groups in ways that they would never consider behaving as individuals? We'll ask questions about the text from the perspective of sociology. And finally, our big 5, and the last one is, of course, the question of theodicy, the question of why must there be pain and suffering in the world, and how can we actually come to that pain and suffering in such an attitude that we no longer ask, why did this happen to me, but rather we learn how to ask, why did this happen for me? We're going to look at these texts and we're going to ask about each one of these big 5, the ways in which they will go together, they will build on each other, and I hope that in the process then it will become an integral study for you. Now let's talk about really quickly the list, of course, the course as it's listed with the headings. Now it's always difficult when you pick up, of course, the humanities and you try and do this kind of heading thing. So these are really general types of headings. If you look at our playlist, though, you'll notice that first we're going to have a series of comments that we'll call introductory after this lecture, Western thought, an intro to Western thought, and I try and leave you with a few word pictures to kind of help you get into your study of the humanities. Then we'll go to the next heading, the big 3 epic stories. We're going to make the argument that if you really want to understand Western humanities, you've got to understand the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. And while there's huge debate about these texts in terms of their viability, I think you've got to, what do we say? We are the stories we accept, the stories we reject. And right away we'll make the argument. You got to know a text before you can decide to reject the story. And I think that when we pick up the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, quite frankly, we're shocked at what it is that we read on a number of counts. Not just so much what's there, but what's not there, what's absent, what's missing. From there, we're going to go to other epic stories. Gilgamesh, we'll talk about Beowulf, we'll talk about the Exeter book, and then we'll move on in our next heading to Greek and Roman drama and philosophy. We're going to spend some time thinking about great plays of the Greek epoch. We're going to get to our Plato, we're going to get to our Aristotle. We'll talk about Aristotelian poetic theory as well as Republic for Plato. Then we're going to pick up a little bit of Marcus Aurelius, and we're going to finish with St. Augustine and his Confessions. From there, I've qualified the next heading as simply pre-Renaissance stories. We're going to look at 2 authors in Chaucer and Boccaccio, especially from the Decameron. And then we'll move on to our Renaissance thinkers. Here we're going to meet Dante and Shakespeare and Milton. Often if you'll hear people talking about the great texts and the great authors in the Western tradition, you'll often hear the names of Dante and Shakespeare and Milton, and we're gonna look at those texts. Before we decide whether they're viable or not, we've got to know what it is that they are about. So we're going to take a look at Dante's Divine Comedy, as well as Milton's Paradise Lost, and a number of Shakespeare plays as well. From there, we'll move on to the Enlightenment. We'll talk about the differentiation of the value spheres as being central to our understanding of the scientific enlightenment, the birth of the scientific method. We've already mentioned science. We're going to meet Bacon, we're going to meet Swift, we're going to meet Pope as three thinkers that represent that tradition. From there we'll go to the Romantic tradition of around 1800. We're going to look at Burns and Blake, we're going to look at Wordsworth, we're going to look at Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Then we'll go to the second generation Romantic British poets, as they're sometimes referred to, of Byron, Shelley, and Keats. And then we're going to finish with the great German writer Goethe. From there, we'll then turn in our heading to American thinkers. We're going to do we'll do chronological study here. We'll do a few thinkers prior to the Declaration of Independence, and then the Declaration of Independence. And of course, that's a sacred document for us as Americans. But too often it's said that it's a sacred document, but there's no argument as to why. I hope that we can flesh that argument out. From there, we'll move on to the Transcendentalists, as they're referred to, Emerson and Thoreau, and especially Walden. And then finally, we're going to look at Whitman and Song of Myself. We'll have detailed lectures on every poem of Song of Myself, and then the poetry of Emily Dickinson. And then we'll move down the timeline all the way to T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. From there, we're going to jump to a heading that's these headings are all arbitrary, but this one's for sure arbitrary. The modern heading, we're going to look at Dostoevsky, we're going to look at T.S. Eliot again, both The Wasteland as well as Four Quartets. We'll look at Joyce, and we'll look at Orwell. And then we're going to finish with a heading, the postmodern. We're going to look at Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, as well as Kafka's Metamorphoses. And then finally, I've got a heading just simply called Future Stories, and we're going to finish this whole series with an analysis of Amanda Gorman's classic, that poem that she presented at the inauguration of President Biden, The Hill We Climb. And by the time you get there, we'll be looking to ask, to what degree does a poem like that, and a statement like that, a story like that, quite frankly, draw on the traditions that we've been commenting on from the Iliad on? I think it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of ways that happens in really powerful ways. So I'm hoping that by the time you get to that last lecture of this course, you'll feel confident that you can really look at the ways that so much is being brought together in that brilliant little offering, The Hill We Climb. Now, finally, how are we going to approach a study like this? Well, let me give you some suggestions. The lectures that you'll be watching have been collected and created and collected over a long period of time. They sit at learnstrong.net, which is where all of our work for Room 303 is. And because of that, I want you to ignore page numbers right away, because we're going to be referencing lots of different texts, and you're not going to have those texts in front of you. If you are interested in running down some of the texts, then obviously you can do that online or elsewhere, but there's no requirement that you have the text in front of you necessarily to do the study. Obviously, I'm going to recommend that as many of these texts as possible, you do get them. If I'm working in translation, I'm almost always going to tell you who the translator is that I recommend that you get, and then follow along with me. Obviously, annotating in the text is a whole lot of fun as well. There is no need necessarily, however, to work in the prescribed order of the course itself. You can jump in and out at any point. So, for example, as you scan through the list, you say, wow, I've always heard of this guy Dante. I've never read anything by him. Then you can jump right away into Dante. However, know that I am going to make references to stuff that comes earlier, so on some count, it might make sense for you to at least go back and listen to some of the stuff and follow some of the stuff that I might make reference to, right? I do recommend that you keep some kind of notebook or journaling system, so that way when you get into further texts, especially at level 3A, when you're asking about how does this relate to stuff I've read and I heard about before, you're able to go back and kind of cross-reference. Obviously, taking notes will be a good way for you to kind of keep organized. But most importantly, I really want to challenge you to have fun and to be challenged by this series of lectures and your introductions to the humanities. And I'm going to challenge you to disagree with me all along the way, because it's the humanities, and we're looking into the sea, and there's a whole lot to be seen there, and there's a whole lot that obviously will be missed and not said, and so I really do challenge you. You have a right to make your own decisions about any of this stuff. Don't pick it up and read it, like, for example, Shakespeare's Hamlet, because me or some other talking head tells you it's a great play. Pick the play up, hear what we have to say, and then you make your decision. I'm of the opinion that if you open at all yourself to any of these texts, you will be challenged. And some of that you will accept, as we've said, stories we accept, and other stories that we don't accept, and that's fine as well. The real challenge, of course, is, and I really do want to challenge you with this, don't reject the sea until you've looked at the roots of the sea. That is to say, spend some time with these texts and then make your decision about whether you want to accept the story or not accept the story. In that regards, finally, you can always come back to LearnStrong.net. You will find that some of the lectures that are a part of this course are a part of a larger series of courses or lectures, like my Harvard Classic stuff or any number of others. I have Song of Myself posted here in this course, but I've given lectures over all of the poems of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, for example. And so you can always come back to LearnStrong.net. I wish you the best of luck as you begin your swimming. Remember what Walt Whitman says at the conclusion of passage 46-47 of Song of Myself. He says, I want you to be a bold swimmer, to push out into the deep, and I want you to laugh and dash with the hair. He that by me spreads a wider breast than my own proves the width of my own. He that proves that is able to destroy the teacher, is what Whitman says. That is to say, the job of the teacher is to help the student be better, and that's exactly what I hope that you will become. I want you to be a strong swimmer in this sea of stories, and to that degree, I hope that you will enjoy our presentation here, and best of luck reading and swimming. Thank you.